The untold chaos behind the Michael Jackson biopic. Picture this. A studio spends more than $150 million on a single film, loses its cinematographer weeks before cameras roll, gets frozen by a nationwide strike, and then, after the movie is already finished, discovers a legal landmine buried in a decades-old settlement that forces them to rip out the entire ending and rebuild it from scratch. That is not a hypothetical disaster scenario. Michael. The long-awaited biopic about the King of Pop. What you are about to hear sounds almost too chaotic to be real, but every piece of it happened behind closed doors while the world waited for a single trailer. Stick around, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly why this film nearly didn't survive its own production. The 2-year hunt for a king. Long before a single frame was shot, the people behind this project faced a problem that had no easy solution. How do you find one human being capable of convincingly becoming the most recognizable entertainer who ever lived? Not just someone who looked the part, but someone who could move like him, sing like him, and carry the same magnetic stage presence that filled stadiums for decades. The search stretched across more than 2 years. Casting teams combed through thousands of hopefuls on nearly every continent, testing dancers, singers, and trained actors, hoping one of them might hold even a fraction of that unmistakable spark. Director Antoine Fuqua and producer Graham King were not simply looking for a look-alike. They needed someone who could reproduce a very specific vocal instrument, an instantly identifiable way of moving, and the emotional depth required to humanize a man the world only ever saw as a superstar. In the end, the answer had been sitting inside the family the whole time. Jafar Jackson, son of Jermaine Jackson and nephew to Michael himself, landed the role in what became his first feature film performance. Think about that for a second. A total newcomer to film acting, walking straight into arguably the most scrutinized casting decision in recent Hollywood memory. If audiences didn't believe him, the entire project, along with every dollar invested in it, was at serious risk of collapsing before it ever reached a single theater. A laugh that stopped the cameras. Not every story from the set carries that kind of pressure, though. One widely shared behind-the-scenes photograph shows a lighter side of production entirely. In the image, Jafar, dressed as a young Michael, is caught mid-laugh alongside the actors portraying his on-screen parents, Catherine and Joe Jackson, while a chimpanzee standing in for Michael's real-life pet Bubbles sits contentedly between them. According to accounts that circulated around the photo, the chimp had apparently mimicked one of Jafar's own facial expressions right in the middle of a serious rehearsal, which sent the entire crew into fits of laughter and forced filming to pause. Nobody has confirmed the full story behind exactly what triggered it, but the image itself captures something rare. A quiet, human moment tucked inside an otherwise pressure cooker production. What do you think set everyone off like that? Drop your best guess in the comments. I want to hear your theories. Winning the matriarch's blessing. Casting a family member is one thing. Getting that family's actual approval is another challenge entirely. Before the production could move forward with any real confidence, it needed the emotional endorsement of Catherine Jackson, Michael's mother, and the family's matriarch. Her support was not a formality. It was treated as essential to the legitimacy of the entire project. Catherine went public with her approval, saying that her grandson had genuinely captured her son's spirit, his fluidity of movement, and his complete devotion to performing. For a family that had spent years carefully protecting how Michael was portrayed publicly, that kind of open endorsement was a significant turning point. It gave the filmmakers a layer of cultural credibility they could not have manufactured on their own, and it gave Jafar the confidence he needed heading into an enormous role. Behind the scenes, it also appears to have eased some of the tension between studio executives, the estate's legal team, and family members who were watching every stage of development closely, all trying to make sure Michael's legacy was handled with care rather than turned into spectacle. Moving into Neverland's predecessor. Rather than leaning solely on old footage and photographs to build his performance, Jafar took a far more immersive route. He relocated for a stretch of months into Havenhurst, the Jackson family's longtime estate in Encino, California, where Michael actually grew up and later returned to throughout his life. Living inside those same hallways, surrounded by childhood keepsakes and quiet personal spaces that had belonged to his uncle, blurred the line between ordinary acting preparation and something closer to lived memory. For the extended family, Watching a young relative walk those same floors while adopting Michael's soft-spoken voice and physical mannerisms reportedly stirred up a wave of nostalgia mixed with grief. That immersive approach is credited with giving his eventual performance a quiet weight that is rarely achieved through conventional biopic preparation. Building a wall to understand a mind. Inside his private workspace at the estate, Jafar assembled something that looked less like typical actor prep and more like an investigator's case wall. Personal letters, private journals, handwritten lyrics, philosophical musings, and detailed timelines, cross-referencing world events with career milestones, were reportedly pinned up in an effort to trace not just what Michael did, but why he did it. Rather than settling for surface-level mimicry, the goal was to understand the psychology behind creative peaks like Thriller and Bad, as well as the private struggles that shaped those same periods. That level of preparation apparently impressed both the crew and the estate handlers overseeing the project, signaling early on that this film intended to dig into the man behind the persona rather than settle for a highlight reel. Blistered feet and broken sleep. Here is where the human cost of this production really starts to show. Jafar had no professional acting or stunt background before signing on. None. Which meant the physically demanding choreography audiences expect from a Michael Jackson film had to be built completely from scratch, under enormous time pressure. Reports describe 10 to 12-hour days spent entirely in the studio, running through spins, intricate footwork, and the moonwalk again and again until his feet were blistered and bloody. That kind of physical strain carries real risk. One serious injury could have derailed the entire production schedule. But by most accounts, Jafar refused every offered shortcut, fully aware that fans around the world know every single one of those movements by heart and would notice the smallest inaccuracy instantly. Earning trust from the people who knew him best. Physical stamina alone wasn't enough. The choreography also had to satisfy people who had actually shared a stage with Michael Jackson. That responsibility fell to Rich and Tone Talawega, veteran choreographers who spent years working alongside him on tours and music videos. By most accounts, the brothers were openly skeptical at first, not because they doubted Jafar's effort, but because they genuinely questioned whether anyone, family member or not, could replicate that exact rhythmic timing and natural instinct for movement. Rather than shrinking from that doubt, Jafar reportedly asked for extra evening sessions on top of an already grueling schedule, slowly turning skepticism into genuine respect. Winning over people who knew those movements from the inside gave the eventual dance sequences a credibility that casting alone never could have provided. Losing the cinematographer before filming even began. Just as pre-production was gaining momentum, the project hit its first major structural crisis. Academy Award-winning cinematographer Robert Richardson, originally brought on to shape the film's entire visual language, exited the project due to scheduling conflicts tied to industry-wide labor disruptions. Losing your chief cinematographer that close to principal photography is not a minor inconvenience. It throws lens choices, lighting design, and overall visual planning into immediate chaos. Producer Graham King and director Antoine Fuqua moved quickly, bringing in fellow Oscar winner Dion Beebe as a late replacement. Beebe had almost no standard preparation window, jumping straight into designing lighting for massive concert recreations, alongside intimate dramatic scenes at the same time. That kind of last-minute scramble tells you a lot about how unstable this production already was before a single day of principal photography had even started. An industry-wide shutdown. Then came a disruption nobody involved with this project could control. Filming had originally been scheduled to begin in mid-2023, but the entire industry ground to a halt when the historic SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes shut down productions across Hollywood. Hundreds of cast and crew members were left waiting in limbo for months after already investing significant time into preparation. Holding costs piled up for the studio, while nobody knew when, or if, cameras would actually start rolling. Through it all, Jafar had to keep his physical training, vocal conditioning, and dance preparation going without any confirmed return date. When filming finally resumed on January 22, 2024, the delay had already blown apart the film's original release timeline, setting off a chain reaction of schedule changes that would follow the project all the way to its eventual premiere. A legal bombshell discovered after filming Wrapped. Now here is the part of this story that genuinely sounds impossible. Picture spending months shooting a film, wrapping principal photography, and believing the hardest part is finally behind you, only to have lawyers discover a problem buried in a legal document from more than 30 years earlier. During routine post-production legal review, attorneys representing the Jackson estate found a binding clause inside a confidential 1993 settlement connected to Michael's accuser at the time, Jordan Chandler. That agreement reportedly barred any film or television production from depicting Chandler or dramatizing the specific legal claims tied to that case. The problem was that the entire third act of the original screenplay revolved directly around the fallout from those very allegations. Can you imagine finding out your finished movie's climax is legally unusable after you have already shot it? Facing the very real possibility of injunctions and expensive lawsuits, the studio had no choice but to scrap the completed ending entirely and rebuild the final act from the ground up. The scene that got erased forever. Among the footage discarded because of that discovery was an elaborate, fully built sequence recreating the 1993 law enforcement raid on Neverland Ranch. Large sections of the estate had reportedly been physically reconstructed for the scene, showing police vehicles rolling through the gates while Michael sat alone inside, quietly absorbing the collapse of his public image. It was intended as the emotional low point of the entire film. But because it directly depicted matters restricted by that old settlement, every frame had to be permanently removed from the finished cut. Losing a fully realized, expensive set piece like that, late in the process, represents one of the more painful sacrifices any director faces, and it left some of the film's most intense material locked away and unreleasable. Rebuilding a movie in 22 days. With the original ending gone, the studio launched an emergency reshoot in June 2025, reassembling key cast and crew to write, build, and film an entirely new third act in just 22 days. Screenwriter John Logan worked around the clock to restructure the story, ultimately shifting the film's conclusion earlier in the timeline, to end on the triumphant note of the 1988 Bad World Tour instead. Rebuilding stadium-scale sets, sourcing period-accurate wardrobe by the hundreds, and locking down actor availability on almost no notice required an extraordinary logistical effort. The director had to move at a punishing pace to make sure the newly shot material blended seamlessly with footage filmed more than a year earlier. It worked, in the sense that it saved the film from a legal dead end, but it demanded a level of pressure that very few productions ever have to survive. What did the reshoots actually cost? Naturally, a crisis this dramatic attracted plenty of speculation, and some of the early reporting on the financial fallout turned out to be significantly overstated. Initial press leaks claimed the emergency rewrite and reshoot had added a staggering $50 million to the budget, painting a picture of a runaway production spiraling out of control. More detailed industry reporting later corrected that figure, placing the real added cost somewhere between $10 and $15 million, still substantial, but far less catastrophic than the original headlines suggested. Notably, the Jackson estate reportedly stepped in to help cover those additional costs directly, sparing the studio from absorbing the full financial hit on its own. Even with more accurate numbers in hand, the entire episode illustrates just how quickly legal complications can inflate the cost of a high-profile biographical film. A budget built for superheroes, spent on a musician. Once every delay, strike-related pause, and emergency reshoot was factored into the final tally. The total production cost for this film reportedly landed somewhere between $155 and $200 million. That is the kind of number typically reserved for CGI-heavy blockbusters, not a musical biopic centered on one man's life. Months of physical training, massive period-accurate set construction, expensive music licensing for one of the most valuable catalogs in the industry, and last-minute production overhauls all added up fast. For the studio, greenlighting a budget of that size was an enormous gamble, one that essentially required the film to break global box office records just to reach profitability, putting extraordinary pressure on the marketing side to deliver once the film finally reached audiences. Tragedy strikes during the rewrite. As if the production hadn't already faced enough obstacles, personal tragedy struck right in the middle of the emergency script overhaul. While under intense pressure to finish rewriting the film's new ending, screenwriter John Logan's Southern California home was caught in the path of the devastating Pacific Palisades wildfire and suffered serious structural damage. Balancing the sudden, personal loss of his own home with an unforgiving studio deadline placed immense strain on him during an already chaotic stretch. It's a reminder that behind every corporate timeline and box office projection, there are real people absorbing real hardship to get a project across the finish line. The fire temporarily interrupted the writing process, adding yet another delay to an already overloaded turnaround window. A release date that kept slipping. All of these overlapping crises forced the studio to repeatedly push back the film's theatrical premiere. The original target was April 2025. After the labor strikes and the emergency script rebuild, that shifted to October 2025, and then again all the way to April 2026. Delaying a global release by a full year is not a small adjustment. It meant the marketing team essentially had to tear down and rebuild an entire international promotional strategy more than once. Sustaining audience excitement across multiple schedule changes proved genuinely difficult, and each new delay sparked fresh speculation from industry analysts about whether the film could actually survive its own production history. Cutting 4 hours down to 2. When Antoine Fuqua completed his first full assembly of the film, the runtime stretched past 4 hours. Given the sheer volume of archival research, full concert recreations, and layered storylines involved, trimming that material down became an emotionally difficult process in its own right. At one point, studio executives reportedly considered releasing the film as 2 separate theatrical parts, just to preserve more of the footage. In the end, the studio committed to a single event-style release, which meant the editing team had to bring the runtime down to 2 hours and 35 minutes. Cutting more than 90 minutes of finished material meant losing complete musical numbers and secondary storylines, turning the editing room into a constant negotiation between protecting the emotional core of the story and delivering a runtime theaters worldwide could actually work with. A family divided on camera. Even with full cooperation from the estate, involvement from Michael's own children varied significantly. His eldest son, Prince Jackson, took an active role as an executive producer, showing up on set regularly to advise on historical accuracy and support his cousin Jafar through an exhausting shoot. His siblings took a different path. Michael's daughter Paris and his youngest son Biggie chose not to participate in the making of the film at all. That split says a lot about how differently the people closest to Michael Jackson view the responsibility of telling his story, and it forced the director to navigate some genuinely delicate family dynamics while the press watched closely for any sign of internal conflict. Paris Jackson speaks up. 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 When those concerns weren't reflected in later revisions, she ultimately chose to step away from the project entirely. She has since spoken publicly about feeling that the film caters to a narrower segment of her father's fan base, one still holding on to an idealized version of who he was, rather than the fuller picture she knew personally. For a project whose promotional strategy leaned so heavily on the idea of family cooperation and authenticity, having his own daughter publicly distance herself created real tension, and it highlights just how complicated it is to tell one person's life story when the people who actually knew him disagree about what the truth even looks like. Setting the record straight. That tension became even more public when actor Coleman Domingo, who plays family patriarch Joe Jackson, suggested in an interview that both Paris and Prince were fully supportive of the project. Paris moved quickly to correct the record, publicly clarifying that his comments did not reflect her actual feelings or her lack of involvement in the film. That moment says a lot about the gap between a polished studio narrative and the messier reality happening behind it. Even once filming wraps, controlling the public story around a project this sensitive remains an ongoing, unpredictable challenge for everyone involved. The trailer that broke records. After years of delays and very public family tension, the film's first teaser trailer finally gave the studio a clear win. It reportedly pulled in more than 30 million views within its first 6 hours online, and surged past 116 million views within a full day, becoming the most-watched trailer debut in the studio's history. That kind of reaction tells you something important. Despite every production disaster, every legal scramble, and every family disagreement playing out in public, global fascination with Michael Jackson's story hasn't faded at all. If anything, the chaos behind the scenes may have only added to the anticipation surrounding the film's eventual release. So here's the real question worth sitting with. After everything this production went through, the lost footage, the rewritten ending, the family divide playing out in headlines, do you think the finished film can actually live up to that history? Which part of this story surprised you the most? Let me know down in the comments. And if you want more deep dives like this one, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next.